Thank you for joining me for lesson 3 in our painting Starry Night in the style of Van Gogh. These are the paints that I've chosen to use for this lesson. So we've got titanium white, cadmium yellow medium hue. Now you just can use a cadmium yellow. It doesn't matter about the medium and it doesn't matter about the hue. We're just going to go with a cadmium yellow. A cadmium red hue. Now you can use a cadmium orange. It's only because I don't have a cadmium orange in my set that I'm going to be using the two together to mix a cadmium orange. Raw sienna. So we're going to go with raw sienna, Windsor blue, cobalt blue hue and cerulean blue hue. Again, you could take cerulean blue out if you don't have it. Please don't worry if you haven't got it. Again, I'm going to go with my daisy palette. A ceramic daisy palette I find far easier to use for acrylics, much easier to keep clean. One little tip I want to share with you in this lesson is quite often you'll get a tube of acrylic and it will have stuck with the lid attached and it's quite tricky to undo. In your set, in your kitchen, in your utensils, you will quite often find at Christmas time particularly you'll have nutcrackers. These are far better to use than pliers. They're wasted to just keep them for Christmas time. Simply loosen your lid. It stops the tubes tearing, it stops you cutting your hands, and you can just open the lid. Always keep pliers or even better nutcrackers in your acrylic set. Far easier on your hands. So just put a spot of each acrylic into your daisy palette, or you can use palette paper. You don't need to use a lot of paint in this lesson, just a dot will do. Acrylic paint cannot be re-wet, so whatever we don't use in the lesson will be thrown away. So we're trying to save wastage. And you'll end up in a mess like me. Just keep a piece of tissue in your box just to clean your hands on. Acrylic paint is permanent, so don't get it on your clothes because it won't come out. The brush I'm going to be using for today's exercise is two. I've got two graduate acrylic brushes. The Dale Rowney graduate line in brushes is perfectly adequate, perfectly good for these exercises. I've got a number 6 round and I have a number 2 filbert. Now a filbert is like a flat brush with a curved end. And it's great for this exercise because we can get into the small areas, but we can also keep our brush strokes, which is what Van Gogh was all about. He was about retaining these brush strokes. What we want to do in this exercise is to just add some small details. We're going to be adding the small details around the stars. If you look at our reference picture, we've got these white brush strokes going around the stars, so we're going to put these in. We're going to darken up the centre of the stars too. We're also going to be putting some depth in. slightly dampen your brush and dip it into the white paint. And just add some white brush strokes going round the stars. You'll see that I finished off the sky in between this class with just a base layer. You can mix a pale blue to fill in any gaps if the canvas is showing through anywhere. And then the same with the star next to it. If the paint is dragging or catching, slightly wet your brush. These top layers are more of a consistency of single cream rather than thick custard on the previous layer. This needs to be slightly thinner in order to move. If it starts to catch, ever so slightly dilute it. You don't want it so thin that it becomes too transparent, but you don't want it so thick that you can't move it. If the paint goes too far up your bristles, wash it off and dry off the excess. You can pick up some cerulean blue as well to give a bit of a a lighter turquoise blue. Again, if it starts to drag, wash your brush. And slacken that paint off a little. Take your time. There's no need to rush acrylic. Let's finish off these stars with the white going round. Don't forget to work left to right if you're right-handed, and right to left if you're left-handed. Otherwise you'll be leaning on your hand, just like I've done. And don't forget to look at this little star here. While that's drying off, I'd like to make a cadmium orange. I'm going to take some of the yellow into a section here, next to the red. Then a tiny bit of red into the yellow. The red is a far stronger pigment than yellow, far stronger. So we need tiny bit of red into the yellow. That's all we need. Wash that brush off straight away. And dry it. Then reshape your brush into a nice point. Pick the acrylic up, just the point of your brush, and dab it into the centre of the star. If it starts to stipple, roll the point of your paintbrush round in the paint to reform it into a tight little point. And just go round the stars that have the dark centre. They don't all. This one here doesn't have one. Then the moon has some dark textures. And some dark brush strokes. So put some of this cadmium orange in. Wash your brush off, dry it, then pick up some of the cadmium yellow and just loosely brush it back over the cadmium orange, just to knock it back slightly. It's so transparent, it'll act as a glaze, but it'll give it a little bit more depth. Then just go round and just see if there's any areas you just want to add in a little bit more cadmium yellow, just on the twirls and the spirals going around the outside. You have to do this when the layer underneath is dry, otherwise what you get is green. The next thing I'd like to do is I'd like to put in this. It's like a raw sienna, but it's very, very pale raw sienna in this swirl, this moving sky. So we're going to take our raw sienna, just some of it, and we're going to mix some with some white. So take some raw sienna to the side, then pick up some white. A little bit more raw sienna. Okay, wash your brush off. We don't want it going too far up the bristles. Dry it off. Now it's not very far, there's not a lot of it, it's not very far in. There's not a lot of it. There's just some sweeping, moving marks. You don't want to put too many in. So just have a check. There will be enough. Any more than that and it would be overkill. Wash your brush off. What this picture needs more than anything is a little bit more depth. It needs depth and tone, and how we're going to achieve that is we're going to put some more cobalt in. Now we want this with brush strokes. We don't want to smooth brush strokes out too much. It certainly needs to go darker. Don't lose the movement. Just keep an eye on your reference photo. You need to make sure you get this sky dark enough. And then we're going to do the swirl. So it becomes very much all in one sky. What you notice is the movement is different. Then we're going to take Windsor Blue. Windsor Blue is really going to darken it. And we're darkening the bits that aren't the swirl. You really must look at the reference photo for this. It's quite nice if your brush strokes start to make different widths, different weights. This is where we start to get the movement in now. And the shadows. Okay, so clean your brush off. And the final thing is we're going to pick up white. Because what we must make sure is that we haven't lost our highlights. And we don't lose our brush strokes. Then with a fine bit of white, let's mix up a mid-blue. Like a bridge. Just like a bridging stroke. Let's just soften any areas that now just seem a little brash or a little harsh. Too much paint on that brush. It's too far down the bristles. Look for any areas where there could possibly be any canvas showing through. There shouldn't really be. Lovely. And whilst we've got the cobalt blue in our palette, what we're also going to do is, with a small brush, we're going to paint in these fields that are just peeping behind the hedgerow, sorry, behind the hillside. There's just a small line of them. Now you want to put it in thickly, undiluted, only using water to help spread it. You can also, whilst you've got the cobalt out, if you need to put in any more brush strokes where it may have gone soft, you can. And there's an area of fields that pops through here. Paint this in solid to begin with. Then pick up some white and just lighten the left side of it and create textures and stripes. Again, just take it over. It's going to show through subsequent layers. But we need to get the underpainting in first. Doesn't matter if the underpainting is patchy or streaky, doesn't matter at all. Because the next layer will cover it up and fill in the weave of that canvas. We just need to get that distant field line in. And again with the next field line underneath. Okay, so taking cobalt and white. We're going to need some more white in the palette. Okay, so that's dried up already. So this is where we would just use our nutcrackers. Really handy to have. It really does save you hurting your hands. Broad sweeping strokes. Let's fill the canvas first. Then we can add colour on top. This is the beauty of acrylic, is we can fill large areas quickly, large expanses, and then layer on top. Okay, so we want to fill that large expanse. And fill the large expanse with cobalt. With acrylic you can go light to dark, dark to light. The only problem or issue with some of the colours is where you get something like a yellow, where that yellow is a translucent colour. So it can be tricky to lay a yellow over, say, a dark green. Or a dark blue. Then you may have to think of layering. We can certainly get these hills in. Furthest hills in the background. Quickly and effectively. Rinse your brush off. Then take the cobalt and start painting the furrows of the field in whilst it's still damp. We can darken this up later in subsequent layers, but it's nice to get this blend whilst the paint's still damp and at a stage where it can be blended. It's just about to get to the point where we can't. And you can feel that it starts to catch. You do start to get to that point where you can feel it. Okay, we need to let that dry. It's at a point where if we tried to paint the darker blue on top, it's not cured. So what it's going to do is it's going to lift off. While Starry could be very impatient and start painting and carrying on, it's not cured and it's just going to lift off. It's at its ugly stage. I always say to my students, everything goes through an ugly stage. This is at another ugly stage. We seem to end lessons on ugly stages, and that's perfectly normal, okay? That's absolutely normal. So you are finishing today's lesson at an ugly stage. You'll probably find yours are too. You can fiddle if you like and tweak, but at some point you have to call it a day and just let your acrylic cure. This now needs to cure overnight before the dark goes on. The dark will be the outline here. Let me show you on the reference photo. Okay, so the dark will be this layer here and this outline before we then go on to paint these green trees in the distance and the buildings. Okay, so it does need to cure in the background.